Okay, thank you everybody for coming back in. Um, this week we are continuing our shiur on the Shemona Esrei with a break from the Shemona Esrei itself because we are discussing Birkat Kohanim. We're not going to be discussing Modim. We're not going to be discussing or Modim proper. We're not going to be discussing Asim Shalom. We're going to be discussing what's placed in between them, and that is the bracha of the Kohanim to the Kahal. So, if you've come to this shiur just to hear about Birkat Kohanim, then please skip ahead a few minutes because we do need to do a little bit of cleanup, so to speak. We have to review a few things we left out for a minute or two at the end of last week's shiur. Last week's shiur, we finished talking about Modim, but we didn't have time to talk about the Nusach too deeply, and we didn't have time to finish talking about Modim Derabanan. So we're going to do that briefly tonight. For a few minutes, and then we'll go on to talk about Birkat Kohanim proper. Okay, so in regards to Modim itself, last week we discussed how Modim is one of those brachot whose history and most of the halachot, the earliest halachot about Modim, lend us to believe that originally Modim was the conclusion of the Shemona Esrei. Essentially, why would there be anything after the brachot of the bakashot? There shouldn't be. After the brachot of the bakashot, Baruch Hashem Shomeh Tefillah, they ended by saying a bracha for the avodah, which was just the earliest liturgical prayer from the Beit HaMikdash. As they ended the korbanot, they said avodah. So too, when they ended Shemona Esrei, they should say the bracha of avodah. And then after that whole section, after Shemay Tefillah and avodah, they would say hoda'ah. You would end the tefillah with hoda'ah. So Modim, we saw, it seemed to make the most sense that Modim was the last bracha of Shemona Esrei. We didn't have a chance to look at the Nusach. However, the Nusach of Modim follows, of course, the typical pattern throughout history, where we have two major recensions. The word recension means major prayer family trees, essentially, where you have two conduits of a text, not prayer, but two conduits of a text. Two conduits is the wrong word. Recensions is the right word, honestly. But two traditions of a text which come down to us throughout history, and those two recensions, those major branches, had their own peculiarities throughout the last 2,000 or so years. Now, those two major recensions, of course, are usually the Nusach Eretz Yisrael and the Nusach Bavel. Reflected mostly, a lot of our data for this from the medieval time comes from the Cairo Geniza. We also have a lot of information from the Rishonim. We have quite a few Machzorim, which give us a lot more information about the Nusach of Modim. However, the Nusach itself is quite complicated because, as already earlier scholars noticed, the Nusach is complicated and has a lot of variation between the major customs, and there doesn't seem to be an easy way to reverse engineer what the original Nusach of Modim was. Now, on here on the screen, we have a table from Uri Arluch, where he has the major versions of, excuse me, as I get here down to, here we go, to the bracha. Okay, good. He has the major versions of Modim listed above, and I'm going to try and move my thing away. Modim, the Nusach Eretz Yisrael was much shorter. Modim anachnu lach atu Hashem Elokeinu ve'Elokei avotenu. In Eretz Yisrael, they didn't really say she'ata with a shin. Al kol hatovot, or al tovotecha asher me'olam ve'al chasedecha v'rachamecha asher mimei kedem. Or similarly, in some of them, al kol hatovot v'chesed v'rachamim shegmaltanu v'shasita imanu v'mavotenu milfanenu. And then they would close with something like Ki melech kel tovu meitivata baruch ata Hashem atov lecha lahodot. Or im amarnu matar aglenu chastacha Hashem yasadenu from the pasuk in Tehillim baruch ata Hashem atov lecha lahodot. There's a couple of variations of this. Sometimes you find in particularly in the Cairo Geniza, there's a cross. There was people who confused the Nuschaot of Bavel with Eretz Yisrael. So you have people in that shul who are saying a crisscross between the two, a bit of a hybrid. And then Nusach HaBavli is famously what we say today, the one that we're familiar with today. But as you'll notice in this table, a lot of them are a lot more concise. But the longest ones, and I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the Modim that we say daily. So the concise ones are more simple. Like the center would be period. That's the whole middle. Or you could have something as long as this. You could have here we go. Hatov kilu chalu rachamecha, Hamrachem kilu tamachasetecha, Ki me'olam kivinu lach, Lo chichamtanu, V'lo ezavtanu, V'lo estartu panecha mimenu. Or you'll have expansions like V'tovecha v'rachamecha v'chasedecha sheb'choleit ta'osa imanu b'vokar Hatov kilu chalu rachamecha, Hamrachem kilu tamachasedecha, or sheb'choleit b'vokar tzarayim Hatov kilu chalu rachamecha. There's a lot of expansions and contractions in the Nusach HaBavli, and it was been particularly difficult to reverse engineer. There's been good efforts by Uri Erlich and Yerachmiel Luger, Yecheskel Luger. I'm sorry. I'm not going to go into the complexities of all that right now. I don't think it's worth our time because we're not going to gain any maskanot from it. But I believe that the assumption, the intuition really, that Ismail Elbogen had 100 years ago was correct. And his assumption is that the nusach of the Al Kulam, Yitbarach v'yitromam, or simply Al Kulam, is there because the expansions were so complex. Essentially, think about it. In almost every siddur you open, you're going to find there's a break after the first section of Modim, and then it says Al Kulam. Why do we have two sections of Modim? At least that's the way the editors of the Siddurim kind of break it up. But it always seems to be broken up that way. Why are there two sections to Modim, unlike all the other brachot? Most likely the V'al Kulam is to try to get back to the original topic because the middle of Modim used to get so embellished with extra ways of praising Hashem and thanking him that you always had to return home and come back to base and get back to the topic at hand. And that's where V'al Kulam Yitbarach. And for all those things that we thank you, Yitbarach Yishtabach Yitbarach, V'chol HaChaim Yedu Chasela, and all the life shall praise you. That's a really good idea. That's an idea that really makes sense to me. And that's, I think, the most useful reverse engineering we could do of the Nusach. And that's probably the most information we're going to get that's useful, in my opinion. I don't think it's possible to perfectly reverse engineer all the vicissitudes of the medieval versions of the Brachav Modim. Now, Modim Derabanan. This part is not complicated. Modim Derabanan. Why is this here? I'm sorry. I must have lost it. Here we go. Modim Derabanan comes from a Gemara in Sotah. The Gemara in Sotah says something very odd. It says, Bizman sheshliach tzibur omer modim, ha'am ma'hem omrim. What is it that people are saying while the shliach tzibur is saying modim? What is that text? Very odd. Like, how do you know people are saying things? Why are you asking this question? In the Gemara Yushami, it asks, what are the things the rabbis are saying during modim while the shliach tzibur is saying modim? So the Gemara says, Amarav, one of the earliest Amoraim, practically a Tana, Rav says, what do we say? Modim anachnu lach Hashem Elokeinu al sha'anu modim lach. Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says, people should say, Elokei kol basar al sha'anu modim lach. Reb Simai says, Yoseinu Yosei Reshit al sha'anu modim lach. Nahar Dayom Amri Mishmei Reb Simai, they would say, Brachot v'adot tishmagad al shechitan v'chem tanu al sha'anu modim lach. Rav Acha bar Yaakov would say, Rav Papa characteristically ends this Gemara by saying, therefore we should say all of them. And that's how the Nusach Bavli came. You'll notice, though, that Baruch Kela Hodot, the last part, Baruch Kela Hodot, is not here. Rather, that comes from the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi's version of Modim Derabanan, so to speak, is much longer. It has a bunch of different opinions for what to say when the Shliach Tzibur is saying the Modim of the Chazara. So what in the world is going on here? First of all, the name Modim Derabanan clearly doesn't mean Modim, which is a Chiyuv Derabanan. It means the Modim which the rabbis would say to themselves. It means the Modim of the various rabbis. That's what the word Modim Derabanan means. But clearly, in the time of the early Amoraim, there was a practice that while the Chazan during Shmona Esrei, during Chazara, would be saying Modim, they would also say something along with him. Why would something like this be done? Now, the true answer is we just don't know. There hasn't been a lot of good work done on Modim Derabanan. Nobody has turned over every stone to figure out exactly why this minhag came to be or how. The best we could say is that, and I believe this is the idea of David Henschke, is that at the end of the Shemona Esrei, it felt like this was the most important part of the Amida. So, for example, we have a Tosefta that says that you're supposed to have kavana by the first and the last bracha of Shemoneh Esrei, or you're supposed to bow by the first and last, because these two, the first and the last, are the most important. Therefore, people felt like they had to join in by the last one. That's a theory. We can't prove it or disprove it simply because there isn't enough information for us to have any idea about the real history of Modim and Derabanan. We're lost. The Nuschot in Yerushalmi are interesting. I recommend if somebody has time, look at it in Brachot, Perak Aleph, Halacha Hey in the Yerushalmi. It's very interesting to look at the other Nuschot over there. Now, let's move onwards. That's so much with our discussion of Modim. Tonight, we're going to discuss Birkat Kohanim. Now, so here's where we should begin. First of all, Birkat Kohanim is nothing new to anybody. Birkat Kohanim is from the Torah itself in Parashat Naso. For the Moshe lemor, daber bnei el Aaron v'banav lemor, kot barachut bnei Yisrael lemor lehem yivrecha Hashem yishmerecha. Everybody knows these famous pesukim. In fact, the oldest, just a cool archaeological fact, is that the oldest written record anywhere in the entire planet of the Torah itself, the earliest written record of the Torah is what's called the Ketef Hinnom scrolls, the silver scrolls. These were scrolls of silver, like an amulet that were rolled up. And on that silver scroll that was found in the 60s, when they unrolled it with better imaging, they were able to tell that what was written on it was Birkat Kohanim. This is from Bayis Rishon. Again, 7th century, very, very, very early. So the earliest copy text we have from the Torah Shebechtav literally is Birkat Kohanim. Now, Birkat Kohanim clearly, as a ritual where you take 10 Kohanim and they get up and they bless the people, is clearly one of the most ancient liturgical rituals in Judaism. If anything, it gives one of the earliest frameworks for how liturgy should be practiced. For example, in the Beit HaMikdash, we know that it was understood that the Chiyuv D'Oraita was that somebody had to call up the Kohanim, right? It's a midrash in the Sifri. It says that someone has to say Kohanim, or someone has to call them up and invite them to say Birkat Kohanim. So clearly, it is a really, really early, it's a really early dynamic between the people being blessed and the Kohanim themselves. This is a very interesting model for a tefillah b'tzibur, where you have a shliach tzibur, you have people praying, you have people answering amen or baruch shem kvod malchuto l'olam va'ed, whatever it was in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash. For example, in the Beit HaMikdash, we know that they would do it in the Beit HaMikdash. I believe it was after the Tamid Shel Shachar and after the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim, before the Korban Shlamim. They would say the Birkat Kohanim at least twice a day. Sometimes, like Yom Kippur, at least they would do it even 4 times a day. We know this from the Mishnayot. So over there, it was a little different than the way we do it today. They would do, for example, all 3 pesukim together, and then the people would answer Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael min ha'olam v'ad ha'olam. Also, they would use the Shem HaMefarash, of course, in the Beit HaMikdash. So Birkat Kohanim is nothing new. It's a Chiyuv D'Oraita. We know that it's an early model for Tefillah B'tzibur. And we know that it's probably as early as, it was almost definitely said in Bayis Rishon as well. There's no reason if there's a mitzvah d'oraita that it shouldn't have been said every day. There's just like absolutely no reason why we should assume that it wasn't. Mesorah of the Goanim is that it was. And Mesorah that we have as the way it seems in the Mishnah is that it was said every day alongside the people, and the people would come to hear the Birkat Kohanim and receive the blessing from the Kohanim. The really interesting question is, when did it get into the shul? When did Birkat Kohanim transfer from the Beit HaMikdash into the shul, into the Beit HaKnesset? Because if you think about it, once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, it's not necessary that there should be a Birkat Kohanim, right? If the Avodah stopped, why didn't Birkat Kohanim stop? So we have a Tosefta in Sotah. The Tosefta says, I hope I took a screenshot of the right one. Kishem, this is very interesting. Did I take a picture of the wrong one? Yeah, you know what it is? That's funny. In the Lieberman edition, Let me stop the share. In the Lieberman edition of the Tosefta and Sotah, it's a little bit later. But essentially, I'll read it to you now. It says Kishem Shebamikdash. I don't have it open. But Kishem Sheish Birkas Kohanim Bamikdash Kain Kain Oimrim. I think it says Kain Sheish Birkas Kohanim Bigvulim, if I'm not mistaken. Let me pause my video for a second and restart it. Hopefully that'll fix what we just went through. It did not. Okay. So I just lost video feed. If you guys can still see me, I hope it's okay. My apologies to anybody watching on the share. So I'm going to share back the screen. Essentially, the Tosefta says that the Tosefta says that in the peripheries, meaning in the surrounding provinces of Yerushalayim, if you were outside the Beis Hamikdash, Bigvulen, outside of Yerushalayim, they would also say Birkat Kohanim. Now, exactly what does that mean? We just don't know. We have no idea what that means. What does it mean that they said it in the peripheries? Did they say it by Shemona Esrei? Did they have a Shemona Esrei in the time of the Beis Hamikdash? Is the Tosefta even talking about? Is the Tosefta even talking about Shemona Esrei in? I'm sorry. Is it even talking about Birkat Kohanim in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, or is it talking about Birkat Kohanim in the time after the Churban by Sheni? We just don't know. Clearly, it's saying that what the Tosefta is trying to teach us primarily is that it's not confined. Birkat Kohanim is not confined to Eretz Yisrael. It's not confined to the Har Bayis. Birkat Kohanim is not confined to Yerushalayim. But by the time of the Mishnah on Brachos, when we get to, let's say, Perek Hey, Mishnah Dalid, we have the Mishnah Brachos says as follows: Ha'over l'fnei ha'teva lo yane achar ha'kohanim amen v'pnei ha'teruf. The Shliach Tzibor is not allowed to answer amen to the Kohanim because he might get confused. You see, the Mishnah in Brachot takes for granted that a person, that the Chazan says in the Chazarat HaShatz, that the Kohanim in the Chazarat HaShatz say Birkat Kohanim. It doesn't instruct us. It just takes it for granted. It doesn't say that this is a takana of the Rabbanim. It doesn't say it's a takana of a certain Tana. It just takes it for granted that you know that in the Chazarat HaShatz of the Amidah, the Shliach Tzibor should be saying Birkat Kohanim. Furthermore, the halacha is different. Unlike in the Beit HaMikdash, where they would say a response at the end of all three brachot, they would say amen after each three. The Gemara actually goes on to specify how people would say more than amen. They would say pesukim, and there was a whole tumult in the Amoraim whether or not it was allowed to answer different pesukim to each pasuk of the Kohanim, what they were saying. Regardless, here the Mishnah seems to be saying that the Shliach Tzibor, if he had to focus on saying amen, he would get confused, and he wouldn't be able to finish the Shemona Esrei with the last bracha properly. Clearly, from the other Mishnayot and the other opinions of the Tanaim, we find a period in the time of the Tanaim where there's a development to how Birkat Kohanim was instituted in the Batei Knesiyot going forward. Meaning, it wasn't just like after the Churban Abayit, you immediately had a understanding and a takana for how Birkat Kohanim should be practiced. It's not clear that Rabbi Gamliel B'Yavne made a takana for exactly how we should do Birkat Kohanim. We find the Tanaim arguing about whether or not you should say it by Mincha, whether or not you should say it by a Tanit. We find different opinions about exactly how Birkat Kohanim should be practiced. And for example, we hold that by Mincha, the Kohanim are not supposed to say Birkat Kohanim because they might be inebriated. We find that we only say Birkat Kohanim, just this seems to be taken for granted, by areas where you have Chazarat HaShatz, but not by Arvit. So evidently, we have a time in the time of the in the era of the Tanaim where the formulation and the practice of how Birkat Kohanim was going to be practiced in the shuls was being formed, which didn't get to its final form probably until the time of the Amoraim. Okay, now we're not going to discuss tonight all of the halachot of Birkat Kohanim. Simply, we don't have the time for that. And furthermore, if anyone is interested, the sugyot are in the Gemara in Tanit Daf Chavav. You have the Gemara in Sotah in the Perek Zayin. Speaks a lot about Birkat Kohanim. In the Torah in Shulchan Aruch in Kuf Chav Chet, there is at great length Birkat Kohanim. It's interesting that the Rambam in his Hilchot Tefillah, he calls it Hilchot Tefillah v'Nesiut Kapayim. He doesn't just call it Hilchot Tefillah because to him, Birkat Kohanim is so central to Tefillah, especially because it was part of the Tefillah in Beit HaMikdash, that for him, it's not Stam Hilchot Tefillah. It's Tefillah, the mitzvah of Tefillah, and the mitzvah of Nesiut Kapayim. Nesiut Kapayim is the name that the Midrash gives to it because it says by Aaron, Vayisa Aaron at Yadav. Now, the main halacha about Birkat Kohanim that I want to talk about tonight, which is interesting from a historical perspective, is the halacha that is the halacha that Birkat Kohanim is a chiyuv d'oraita, which should be said every day. Now, this isn't a simple idea because the Minchas Chinuch compares the mitzvah of Birkat Kohanim to the mitzvah of Tefillin. Mitzvah of Tefillin is a mitzvah or a mitzvah of tzitzit. These are mitzvot given to us in the Torah without a specific time frame. It doesn't tell us when to do it. It just says to do it. The assumption that we have, and that's our Mesorah, we just simply don't have it written directly anywhere in the Talmud, is that these mitzvot are to be done every day. However, history is, of course, more complicated than that. Rabbi Ephraim Karnefogel, who's a historian who works for, I think, Toro College, a big Talmud Chacham. One of his earliest papers was a discussion of how in the time of the Baalei HaTosafot, there was clearly a minhag in many places in Europe where people just didn't put on tefillin every day. The Tosafot don't like it, and they come out against it. But clearly, it wasn't always universal that people wore tefillin every day. It was assumed by the poskim that the mitzvah is wearing tefillin every day. However, because it never said it anywhere explicitly, there was no way to police it and no way to educate people properly. So the Baalei Tosafot had to come and tell people that, no, this is our Mesorah, this is the halacha, you have to put on tefillin every day. The same is true by Nesiut Kapayim, by Birkat Kohanim. If you look at the early texts of the Rishonim, if you look at all of the early poskim, you just don't find, I'm sorry, I interrupted my share of the screen, but there's actually no video feed. There is nowhere in the early Rishonim that you find anybody entertaining the idea that you shouldn't say Birkat Kohanim ever. Birkat Kohanim is something you say by every Shachrit. However, today, you will have Kihilot, which will only say Birkat Kohanim on Shabbat, or you will find Kihilot that will only say it on Yom Tov, and not just only on Yom Tov, but only on Musaf of Yom Tov, or not on Musaf and Yom Tov, but not on Simchat Torah Musaf. You'll find all sorts of interesting minhagim. And this is actually quite perplexing. How in the world should anybody not be doing a mitzvah d'oraita? The Rambam brings from the Yerushalmi. He seems to qualify the Yerushalmi a little bit. The Yerushalmi says a person who doesn't say Birkat Kohanim is a Kohen who doesn't do Birkat Kohanim is over in the three mitzvot aseh, like Amor Lahem, Ko Tevarachu. There's three mitzvot aseh, which a person, he says it's as if you were over. He doesn't really believe that, it seems. It seems that it's one mitzvot aseh. But he says it's almost as if you were over in three mitzvot aseh if you don't say Birkat Kohanim every day. So if the Kohanim are available and they don't bless the Kahal, then they are over in a mitzvah aseh. So where did it come from that the Ashkenazim don't say it every day? We don't know. The earliest source for this is the Agur. The Agur lived in the 15th century, quotes the Maharil of Leib Molin. The Maharil, whose caver is pictured here, was asked about why is it that in our neighborhoods in Ashkenaz or in your town, why is it that we don't do Birkat Kohanim? So what he answers is, well, you have to understand the minhag used to be that the Kohanim would do tevilah. They would go to mikvah in the morning, and it became too much of a tircha to do mikvah in the morning. Furthermore, people have to go to work, and it makes the davening too long. Therefore, they started taking it out of the davening. People stopped saying it because they didn't have time. Furthermore, You could also find an excuse that if you simply don't call up the Kohanim, if you don't say Kohanim, then suddenly they're not obligated. It's like a loophole. You know the chiyuv is to say Kohanim, right? That's where you have you have to say Kohanim before they get up, and they have to do it by Ritzei. There's a whole selection of halachot brought in the Gemara. But if you don't call them up, then maybe that's a loophole, and they don't have to come up. So the Beit Yosef is extremely dissatisfied with this idea of the Maharil. Because especially if you're a fan of halacha and do halachic process, there's absolutely no reason, and in no universe is it appropriate that a minhag should trump halacha. That just does not exist. And this is one of the real dangers of adopting new minhagim. For example, taking a minhag like, we should do tevila before doing Birkat Kohanim. Who said you could be Yotzei Birkat Kohanim without doing mikvah in the morning? So a lot of the rabbis are very wary of adding new minhagim, even if they're nice, because what happens is that people conflate minhag with halacha, and what ends up happening is that they feel like one halacha is that what their minhag is more important than the halacha itself, and so you find mistakes like this. The Beis Yosef also mentions that clearly this was a minority custom. It doesn't seem like this was universal. They were asking about his location, and he was giving a forced apologetic for their location, why they didn't do it. It's not that he likes it. The Maharil is clearly not a fan of it, but he's trying to be Molamed Zchus on these Kehilos, which don't do it. However, the Ramah builds upon this idea because he needs to answer with more apologetics, because by the time of the Ramah in the 16th century, already people, the late 15th century, most Kehilos in Ashkenaz were not doing Birkat Kohanim. So he adds another idea. He says, well, maybe Birkat Kohanim should only be said if a person is besimcha, and if it's not Yom Tov, a person is not in the highest madrega of simcha. Even Shabbos, people are still worried about work on Shabbos. They don't think about it, but they don't say it. Therefore, unless you're not totally besimcha, you shouldn't do Birkat Kohanim. Which is a very odd apologetic, but that's essentially the route that the Ramah takes. Now, frankly, the opinion of the Beit Yosef and the opinion of most poskim was that this was ludicrous. And this is not how a halachic process should work. And this is a prime example about how minhagim, even well-intentioned ones, can be disastrous for the let's call it the domain of halacha. Now, there's many reasons minhagim are very dangerous for halacha. And this is why Rabbeinu Tam said that minhag is gematria gehenim. He meant it as a critique of minhagim, because sometimes people conflate them with halacha, and sometimes people conflate culture, which is absolutely nothing to do with Judaism, with minhag or with halacha. And very often minhagim can lead people to do practices which are either not Jewish or not halachic, and can lead to all sorts of confusion. And therefore, a lot of the Geonim and the early Rishonim were very puritanistic about, they were great halachic purists. They didn't like adding certain types of minhagim, new practices to Yiddishkeit, if they weren't called for explicitly in Torah Shebal Bichtav or Torah Shebal Peh. Over here, you end up having a so-called quote-unquote minhag, not to do a mitzvah d'oraita. Just the absurdity is absolutely astounding. Now, in the time of the Achronim, the people like the Gra and Rav Chaim Volozhin tried to reinstate Birkat Kohanim. There is a sefer biography about the Gra written shortly after his death called Aliyot Eliyahu, and I think it was on page 56 and 57. There's a story over there, I believe, with Rav Chaim Volozhin, where Rav Chaim Volozhin tried to reinstate, or maybe it was also the Gra, tried to reinstate Birkat Kohanim, and there was chaos or a fire in his town, burnt down half the town and the shul. So they didn't even though the Gra wanted to start saying Birkat Kohanim the following day, he decided that the fire in the town was a siman that he shouldn't continue doing it. Now, a lot of people are aware of this anecdote, and they're like, oh, that's a raya, that it's very dangerous and we should no longer practice Birkat Kohanim. However, anecdotes have no legal precedent, and an anecdote has no business telling you what to do or what not to do for halacha. That's just a very frank way of saying that, frankly, the anecdote should really mean nothing for halacha. So the Gra himself and his Talmidim, when they went to Eretz Yisrael, the Gra's Talmidim were some of the earliest Ashkenazi immigrants to Eretz Yisrael. They had the freedom to start their own new minhagim and to follow the minhagim of the Gra, and they began saying Birkat Kohanim in Eretz Yisrael, even though they were Ashkenazim, and that minhag has persisted until this day, where the Ashkenazim in Eretz Yisrael do Birkat Kohanim, which is beautiful. So, where does that leave us? One more interesting piece of history is that Birkat Kohanim was instituted in the time of the Shabtai Tzvi. In the time of the Shabtai Tzvi hysteria, there were some communities in Amsterdam and Portugal which began as like a celebration of the coming of Mashiach, so to speak. They began saying Birkat Kohanim and celebrating that the Mashiach came by saying Birkat Kohanim on Shabbat. After the debacle, when he converted to Islam, they turned to the poskim. I think it was like the Ohel Yaakov. I'm trying to remember who it was. Ohel something. One of the early poskim. They turned to him for advice because, like, oh, you were the guy who was always against Shabtai Tzvi. What's the halacha now? What should we do? That now that you proved us wrong, and that he converted to Islam, should we continue saying Birkat Kohanim on Shabbat? And he said no, because that's just a minhag that you started in hysteria. Don't what do you call it? Don't continue that minhag. My suspicion is that the real reason that Vilna Gaon had such pushback from his community when he tried instituting Birkat Kohanim was because they all associated it with the Shabtai Tzvi movement. They're like, oh, no. We're not going to start doing Birkat Kohanim like those Shabtai Tzvi knickers. So the Sabbateans. So that's my suspicion for the history for why Birkat Kohanim never took off. There are still some Spanish Portuguese Jews today who will do it only on Shabbat. They consider that that was an early minhag of Sfarad. So that's some of the history for that. Now, okay, we've discussed how Birkat Kohanim went from the Beit HaMikdash to the Beit HaKnesset. We discussed how in the Birkat Kohanim of the time of the Tanaim, the regulations were still being formed, and how it should be done in the Beit HaKnesset and in the Amidah was still being formed. By the time of the Amoraim, we had minhagim beginning their formulation and minhagim that are beginning to get taken out, such as saying different pesukim during the Birkat Kohanim, and likewise saying a Yehirat Son, saying like a Yehirat Son after Birkat Kohanim, which is in the Siddur. I think after Birkat Kohanim they say, and I'm sorry, I'm not a Kohen, so I don't know this. It says, Yehirat Son, Ribono shel halamim, asinu ma shegezarta aleinu, aseh ata ma shetartanu, ashkif imon kodshech min hashamayim, uvarech et hamachal et Yisrael. This also comes from the Gemara. Now, I'm sorry to any of my viewers if the video cut out. It's a shame, but I'm having technical issues with my webcam, which we'll have to fix at another time. Now, if you think about and then finally we discussed why today we don't say Birkat Kohanim so much, why the Ashkenazim don't say it today, and how possibly that minhag disappeared. Now, let's think about for a second the era of the Amoraim and the Tanaim again. If you think about the placement of the Birkat Kohanim, why is it in the Amidah? Right, just think about this. Let's zoom out for a second. Why is Birkat Kohanim in the Amidah itself? If it was a Gamliel B'Yavneh, if it was the Tanaim, whoever decided that it had to go from the Beit HaMikdash to the Beit HaKnesset, why didn't you make it a separate prayer? Why didn't you make it a tefillah which stands on its own? Why did it have to be a part of the Chazarah of the Shmona Esrei? That's the first. That's the fundamental framework that I want you to think about. And I think that the fundamental framework that we could place Birkat Kohanim into, and the reason that it makes sense being in the location where it is because of our theory last week, which is that the Birkat the bracha of Modim was the final bracha of Shemona Esrei. And there's a dialogue between Klal Yisrael and Hashem. After we finish blessing Hashem by saying all the brachot of Shemona Esrei, we in return bless. So the Kohanim in return say that Hashem blesses us. The Sifri Amidbar says as follows: Yisha Hashem panav elecha b'shah she'ata omed v'mitpalel. That's when Hashem is Yisha Hashem panav elecha. Shenamar v'yomer elav hine nasati panecha. Right. What the Sifri is saying, that when is it a time for Hashem to arise to show us His countenance? That's after or when we pray. It sounds like the originally Birkat Kohanim was a response to the Hoda'ah. Now that puts into question, what is the purpose of Sim Shalom? So, okay, I understand why perhaps Birkat Kohanim is placed at the end of Shemona Esrei. It's seen as a blessing to Klal Yisrael in dialogue with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, that's a sensible place to put it. We didn't make it a separate prayer. Fine. Now, what is Sim Shalom doing? Why does Sim Shalom exist? If you're going to tell me that Sim Shalom is to a prayer that should take effect, that the Birkat Kohanim should take effect, we answer Amen 3 times. What's wrong with Amen? If you're going to tell me that it's a prayer from the Kohanim, or the Shliach Tzibor, that the prayer should take effect, the Kohanim already have a Yiratzon. So what is the whole purpose of Sim Shalom? Furthermore, if you look at the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, Hey Dalid, which we saw before many times, it says by the end of the Rosh Hashanah Amidah in the Mikdash, they would end with Avoda, Hoda'ah, and Birkat Kohanim. It never says the word Sim Shalom at all. Because of these facts, Rabbi David Henshka argues very strongly that Sim Shalom was not a response to Birkat Kohanim, as many scholars earlier assumed. Sim Shalom was not a response of the Shliach Tzibor to the Birkat Kohanim, because it's completely unnecessary. Sim Shalom was a substitute for Birkat Kohanim for when there were no Kohanim. Meaning, instead of saying the version that we have today, which is Barchenu bebracha mushulashet batorah, they would say Sim Shalom tova bracha, like by Mincha. And eventually, because it was so commonly said by the Shliach Tzibor, by Mincha, or by places where there were no Kohanim, people began to understand it as the last bracha of Shemona Esrei. And that's how it got added to the Shemona Esrei. But Sim Shalom originally wasn't a bracha on its own. And it's very interesting because the Tanoim, in the Tanoic sources, you never find the Tanoim ever saying anything about a bracha of Sim Shalom. Only in the brachot, only in the sources of the Amoraim, in the Gemarot, do you ever see anybody talk about a bracha called Shalom or Sim Shalom. And it's to me, a very convincing argument that Sim Shalom came a lot later, and it was a substitute for the bracha of Kohanim when there was no one there. I should add that the Barchenu bracha Mishlashet Batorah is a very mysterious tefillah, because we know that all the ancient sources have it. It's in not ancient, I say the old nusachim of the nuschaot of the Sidurim, the Siddur of Sadia, Siddur of Amram, they all have it, but we have no idea where it comes from. It's probably very early, because all of the nuschaot are identical. Almost all of them are identical. It says, Elokeinu Elokei Avotenu Barchenu B'Bracha Mishlosh B'Torah Keduva Al Yidei Moshe Avdecha Amur Al Yidei Aaron Benecha Kohanei Am Kodeshecha Kamor Yivrach Hashem Yishmerecha. We have no idea where it comes from, but most likely it's as early as the Amoraim. One thing I'll point out is that the grammar is very strange, because if you look at the regular tefillahs, we have it in the Sidurim today, it'll say Al Yidei Aaron Uvanav Kohanim Am Kedoshecha, your holy people. It's kind of strange to call the Kohanim Am Kedoshecha. However, as we know, the Mishnah in Yoma does say that. It says, Ani uveiti uvnei Aaron am kidoshecha. The Kohen Gadol in the Beis HaMikdash does say it. He says, me and Bnei Aaron am kidoshecha. There's nobody who has a different gersa of that Mishnah. But the Seder of Amram doesn't like Kohanim am kidoshecha. Instead, he says, Kohanei am kidoshecha. The Kohanim of your holy people. Not that the Kohanim are a holy people, rather they are the Kohanim of a holy people. Similarly, I think it's Rabbi Yosef Kimchi, the father of the Radak, says that it should be Kohanim bi'am kodshecha. And another gersa is Kohanim le'am kodshecha, meaning that the Kohanim are giving the bracha to your holy people. So there's some discussion of this. If you want all the sources, I think there was an article put in Tradition magazine a number of decades ago, which went through all the sources on the different nuschaot of this bracha, but mostly they've remained essentially the same. So thank you to everybody for your time, for your attention. We've already reached time. We're about to start our VTR. And we will end the Shur on Birkat Kohanim here. B'ezrat Hashem, next week we will continue with more information and more theories for how Sim Shalom developed, perhaps how it was born. And we will, with that bracha, I believe we will finish our limud on Shemona Esrei. So thank you for tuning in.